My name is Nick Chase, and I have the distinct pleasure of interviewing and talking with today retired federal magistrate judge Karen Klein as part of the Historical Society for the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. First, Judge Klein, I want to talk about your upbringing. And I know just from knowing you for many years that was in the Minot, North Dakota area. And I also know that it was on a farm or in a farming area. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
About your upbringing?
Sure. I was raised on a farm about 10 miles southeast of Minot. My brothers still operate the farm. I was the oldest of 6 children. And so I'm asked all the time, you grew up on a farm, you must be really good at using machinery and backing trailers. But actually, I did none of those things. And I was a built-in caregiver for my younger siblings.
Okay.
So that was my principal job on the farm.
So as you're growing up, what did you want to do when you grew up?
I always wanted to be a teacher. And I had a teacher during high school, my math teacher during high school, who was a phenomenal teacher. She wanted me to go to MIT. And the thought of that terrified me. And no one in my immediate family, other than one of my father's brothers, had gone to college. And so the thought of even bringing that up to my parents just seemed too out there. So I ended up instead going to Minot State. I was going to become a math teacher. When I started college, a few math courses in, when the math problems become heavily laced with physics, I just lost interest. And when you lose interest and don't work very hard at it, it becomes very difficult. So I did an about-face and ended up with a history and political science degree and a math minor.
So, unlike a lot of people who go kind of straight through, they do their college undergrad and then go to law school directly, you definitely had a couple years in between there.
I did.
Between college, where you leave college thinking, I'm going to be a teacher. You said you didn't even know any lawyers. So being a lawyer was not even in your brain at this point.
It wasn't on my radar screen at all. No.
So at this point, before you go to law school, in this time period, and that's the part I kind of want to ask you a little bit about, is what happens between the point of I want to be a teacher to maybe I want to go to law school? Tell me about those years.
Well, first I looked for a teaching job, and then when I was unable to find one, at least in a location that was acceptable to me, I took a job as a bank teller. And then I went from that to a loan processing person. But in those days, there were no women like bank loan officers. Mm-hmm. They were just basically assistants and processors. So I did that for about 2 years, and it was pretty unsatisfactory. So I joined the VISTA program, which at that time was the Domestic Peace Corps.
Sure.
And I was in VISTA for about 18 months before I started law school.
And what part of the country were you in when you were in the VISTA program?
I was assigned to a paralegal program because by then I had started thinking possibly about law school, but I wasn't ready to make that decision yet. So I was sent to Coffeyville, Kansas, which is on the Oklahoma border of Kansas, very close to the borders of Missouri and Arkansas as well. It's a very poor pocket of the South.
You started talking about in a paralegal program, and that's when you started thinking about maybe being a lawyer or at least that type of a career. How does that happen? Like, what made you start thinking about the legal profession, whether it be paralegal or lawyer or whatever it is?
Well, during the time that I was working at banks, I just kept feeling like I need to do something that's more challenging and something that's more fulfilling. And I don't know, I think just my interest in history, my interest in reading, led me to think maybe I should consider law school. And then a couple of friends, I sort of vaguely mentioned it to some friends, and they encouraged me to apply. And so I, one day, drove from Coffeyville, Kansas to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to take the LSAT. And then decided to go to law school where I could afford to go to law school. So I applied back at UND.
In law school, at some point you were the editor-in-chief of the Law Review.
I was.
Which for people who would listen to this podcast, who maybe know you but don't know a lot about law schools or the law, the Law Review is what?
The Law Review is an academic journal, basically, that where the authors write scholarly articles, and it's a compilation of articles written by students, along with articles written by lawyers or law professors. And there is a student board of editors that is selected at each law school that has a law review or law journal.
And the writing itself is very strenuous. I mean, it is highly researched, and it takes months and months to write a law review article. Isn't that right?
Yes. I mean, in addition to researching the content very heavily, and it is heavily footnoted, so you have to have authority for every statement you make. But the format is also very stylized, and it takes a long time just to get familiar with the format.
And ultimately, these are going to be published, so the whole world is going to be able to see if you know what you're talking about.
Correct.
So
there you are.
At first, did you write? Did you go through the writing process and write an article like that for the Law Review?
I did write an article during my second year of law school. And in order to be on the board of editors, the student board of editors, you have to have written a publishable form article. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be published, but it has to be in publishable form.
Now, at some point, you became the editor-in-chief of that journal, which, again, for people who don't know a lot about law school or the law in general, being editor-in-chief is extremely a huge accomplishment for any law student. How did that feel with the person who never knew a lawyer, who didn't go directly to law school? All of a sudden, you're named the editor-in-chief of the Law Review. How does that feel at that point?
The reason I wrote for Law Review was I realized once I started law school that I hadn't done enough writing. I hadn't been asked to do enough writing when I was in high school and in college. And if I was going to be a decent lawyer, I really needed to get some experience in writing. So I offered to write for Law Review, and then the editor-in-chief who preceded me came to me and recruited me and said, "You should apply to be editor-in-chief." I was floored. And no woman, of course, had been on the editorial, or at least at editor-in-chief of the North Dakota Law Review before. So I thought, okay, he thinks I can do it. I'll put my name in, and I was selected. And again, it was one of those things where you just, once you're there, you do it. And the editorial board, was a great group of really bright students, and it was a lot of work. It's a lot of work in addition to your regular coursework, but it was a really rigorous, disciplined exercise that I think served me really well.
Now, I happen to know, just for having worked with you, that you value the whole writing process a lot, even from the standpoint of being a judge.
I do. I do.
So do you think a lot of the things you learned in writing for the Law Review and being editor-in-chief, was kind of fed into a lot of the skills that you needed to be a judge?
Yes, they did. I've never written anything again after Law Review that is quite as rigorous. Even writing as a judge is at least format-wise and research-wise, because we simply don't have the time as judges to delve into a topic as deeply as you do when you write for Law Review. But having done that really taught me a lot about how to write, how to organize, how to research, and that all served me really well as a judge.
So as you're in law school, are you at this point thinking, what kind of law do you think you want to do when you're in law school? What kind of a lawyer do you think you want to be?
I had no idea. I really didn't. I just was looking forward to finishing school and trying out some areas of the law. And then the same guy who recruited me to be editor-in-chief of the Law Review, the previous editor, told me he had applied for a federal judicial clerkship and he hadn't gotten it. And he thought I should apply for it with the same judge to see if I could get it. And so I thought, I hadn't really thought about doing a judicial clerkship, but I applied for it with Judge Paul Benson, who was then the chief judge of the District of North Dakota. And he had never had a female law clerk. And so I interviewed with him, and lo and behold, I was offered the position. And I thought for a while maybe he offered it to me because he felt sorry for me, because I actually went to my interview in the wrong community. So he had scheduled my interview when he was hearing cases in Grand Forks, and the post office somehow shredded my invitation letter, inviting me for an interview. And I tried to put the pieces together, and the piece that I didn't find or that didn't fit right was the piece that said it was in Grand Forks rather than Fargo. So I had the street address, but I didn't have the town. So I drove to Fargo that day. I could not find the address.
I've never heard that story before, and as you're telling it, I'm getting a sick feeling in my stomach just for you.
I was sick. Yeah. I thought, there it goes. Yeah. I'm not getting this job.
But you did.
But I did.
Now tell me a little bit about, I've met Judge Benson. He was still a senior judge when I met him. And I think anybody who was casting a movie for like a distinguished looking judge might pick somebody who looked just like Judge Benson.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you couldn't call casting and find somebody who looked more like a judge.
Yeah.
I mean, he was tall and had great posture and a shock of white hair, and he could really put on a stern look if he wanted to. But what we found behind the scenes, and lawyers were afraid of him because he ran a tightly controlled courtroom. But among his staff, he would really relax, and he was really a kind man, and he had a pretty decent sense of humor. And it was really nice to get to know a judge behind the scenes like that.
Did you work for him? How long did you work for him?
I had a 2-year clerkship. And then I went into private practice, joined a law firm, and they assigned me to do mostly transactional work, but in the commercial area. Mm-hmm. A little bit of related litigation, but a lot of it was transactional in nature, which I didn't feel was really, after my clerkship, where I spent a lot of time writing and researching, it was just not the same kind of work at all. Well, during your clerkship, all you see is litigation. And I knew I didn't want to be a criminal defense lawyer, but I thought I might want to be a litigator, either a civil litigator or a prosecutor.
As you're clerking for Judge Benson, Are there any other women judges around at this point?
There were none. Well, I was his first female law clerk, so there weren't many women lawyers, period. And there were no women who were judges until in the 1980s, which was right after my clerkship.
Now, at some point, you're practicing law and you get a call about a possible judgeship. Could you tell me about that?
Well, out of the blue one day, I got a phone call from Norma Flory, who was Judge Benson's judicial assistant. And she told me a new position has been authorized for our court, a magistrate position. It was then called, and now the title's changed some years ago to magistrate judge. And she said, we had asked for a full-time position. Unfortunately, we were only authorized a half-time position, but we're still hoping it'll become full-time very soon, and Judge Benson would like you to apply for it.
So Judge Benson, your former employer, your mentor, reaches out to you, or has somebody reach out to you and recruits you to apply for this job.
So what do? You don't turn your mentor down. I applied. I wasn't sure I'd like it. I was a little afraid of it, I think. And I didn't know anything about the position because there had not been, a magistrate judge position in the District of North Dakota other than very, very part-time where the magistrate judges now would only issue like arrest and search warrants. It was very behind the scenes. I don't even know that they did any court hearings. At least I never saw any while I was a law clerk.
Now, and again, people who don't know a lot about federal practice, currently federal magistrate judges handle everything other than felony criminal matters. They preside over civil jury trials if the parties consent to that. They do all the preliminary work in civil cases, and they do many of the preliminary matters in even criminal felony matters, and even a lot of misdemeanors you don't even need the parties to consent to. I mean, they even will hear of those criminal matters. But what was it back then?
Well, at the time I was appointed, which was in January of 1985, the statute did authorize consent trials, civil consent trials, and it did authorize misdemeanor cases, but they had to be on consent as well. But there were very few districts that were actually assigning significant civil duties to magistrate judges. So mostly they were doing procedural motions, non-dispositive motions, and they were doing dispositive motions like summary judgment motions in civil cases with a report and a recommendation to the district judge. They were not doing many trials. Only in a few districts nationwide were magistrate judges being utilized to the full extent authorized by the law.
And in this state was very a reflection of the rest of the country in that the bar, nobody here really had any experience with a full functioning federal magistrate judge.
They did not.
So you had a blank slate, really, when you went into this job.
I did. And the district judges, Judge Benson and Judge Bruce Van Sickle at the time, who was very shortly to take senior status, but they weren't, I don't think, actually quite sure what to do with me either. And they just said, well, why don't you just do whatever it is that the law allows you to do, the Magistrates Act. And so I just started doing things. And we, the lawyers initially weren't quite sure how to treat me, how to address me, what I could do, what I couldn't do. But I think they were pretty quick to be accepting of having, another judicial officer that could help move their cases through the system.
So you get selected for this job, and this kind of begins a 30-year career where both locally and nationally, the federal magistrate judge went from a fairly undefined, underutilized position to one. Would it surprise you? I researched this before, but I think there, as of 2011 anyway, several years ago, there were already like 575 magistrate judges handling over hundreds of thousands of matters a year at this point. I mean, so they're a very active part of the federal judiciary at this point. But when you first started, they weren't.
They were not. And a lot of courts, frankly, just didn't know what to do with magistrate judges. And as I learned later during the 90s, when I served on the Judicial Conference Committee on the administration of the magistrate judges system, that a lot of districts, unfortunately, use their magistrate judges essentially as glorified law clerks because they just really were not forward-thinking or, really testing, I think, the limits of the authority that Congress had authorized.
And when you first started, you were still in your 30s, is that correct?
I was. I was selected when I was still 34. I turned 35 in late December of 1984. Now that, I guess, gives away my age. And in January of 1985, January 7th, 1985, I was appointed half-time. And then December 1st of that same year, so 11 months later, the position went full-time. And I had to reapply for it. But fortunately, I had the benefit of incumbency. And so I was appointed to the full-time position.
Now, becoming a federal judge, including, any kind of federal judge, is usually like a capstone of a career, here you are 34 when you're selected, 35, you've just become a federal judge. This person, you were somebody who didn't know lawyers growing up, hadn't thought about becoming a judge, didn't know any female judges. How does that feel when you become a federal judge at age 35?
I didn't dwell on it. I just got in and started working. And I used, to a great extent, what I had learned through my clerkship about what judges do and what works and what doesn't work. And I just started setting proceedings, doing hearings, writing motions.
And a big part of that is that parties had to agree for you to help resolve their cases. And unlike a federal district judge, you're kind of stuck with whatever judge is there. But a federal magistrate judge, both sides have to agree that you are going to resolve their civil case before the case even starts. So reputation is kind of important.
It is. And, I didn't, frankly, realize how young I was when I first started, or really even how inexperienced I truly was until I looked back years later. But it took a while. It took a year or two for the parties to begin accepting me as their trial judge and consenting to have their civil cases heard by me. And so I was trying to do whatever I could to help move cases along. And so one of the things that the law authorized, the civil rules authorized, but that wasn't being implemented in the District of North Dakota was settlement conferences by judges. So none of the judges in the district had ever done one. They felt it was, they were just uncomfortable, frankly, even bringing up the topic with the lawyers. If a case settled, fine. If it didn't, and it went to trial. So I started setting settlement conferences. I had received no training in mediation skills. had never seen a mediation, but I just started meeting with the parties and the lawyers, and eventually kind of figured it out. Well, it really is a process in which you try to bring the parties around to the realization that this is their one and only opportunity to exercise some control over the outcome of their dispute. And they have the right to a trial, but they need to understand that to get a resolution through a trial or on a motion, you basically turn the outcome over to someone else. You have no control over the outcome. And they need to understand that their resolution through settlement will never be what their best day in court will be, but it will also never be what their worst day in court will be. And they start to realize that, maybe taking the risk of having their worst day in court be realized is just not a risk they want to take. People are actually more risk averse than they realize they are when they make that decision to bring a lawsuit. And they very often are much more satisfied with a settlement resolution that they've agreed to, that they've helped fashion, than they are with having a decision handed to them, even a decision in their favor. The Federal Judicial Center is the research and education arm of the federal court system. And I chaired their education committee for magistrate judges for a few years, and then I served on the board of the Federal Judicial Center, which is an appointment by the Chief Justice for several years. And it was during my involvement with their education programs that the center developed a program for teaching mediation skills to district judges, magistrate judges, and bankruptcy judges. And I have served on the faculty of that workshop ever since it was first designed. And in fact, even in retirement, I still serve on the faculty of that program.
I remember one time working for you, and you came out of your office and you said that Chief Justice William Rehnquist had just called you on the phone. And I don't know how many times you've ever talked to the Chief Justice of the United States. For me, it's zero. So, I mean, but that's a fairly monumental thing.
It is. As I recall, I think that call was to appoint me to the Judicial Conference Committee on the Magistrate Judges System. Mm-hmm. But then later, I also got a call to serve on the Judicial Conference Committee on Information and Technology. And in between those, I served on the Federal Judicial Center Board. And the Chief Justice is the chair of that board. So it's a small board. It's maybe 7 or 8 people. And they meet at the Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice presides at the meetings. So that was a very special opportunity.
No kidding. So, back to your settlement process, that is this something that made sense to you right away on how to get people to resolve, or is this something that you just developed over a long period of time?
I think the first couple of instances were pretty unsatisfactory to me and maybe to the litigants, but eventually I think I encountered cases where the parties really wanted a resolution. And then I just started figuring out that really all it involves is listening, empathizing with people, not agreeing with them, but listening to them and empathizing with them, and then ultimately bringing them around to this realization that they really don't relish taking the risk and incurring the expense of a lawsuit. And they would just as soon put it behind them and move forward with their lives.
What stops people, do you think, in a conflict from reaching a settlement or a compromise? Like what are the hurdles? What do you think stops people from actually getting to that point on their own?
I think the fear of looking weak, looking like they're caving. And I think the mediation process gives them some cover where they don't really have to admit that they're kind of giving up on the fight.
And I know you have talked before about the one involving the Dakota gasification plant was a big case in terms of like the money involved, the jobs involved. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Sure. And I would like to contrast that with another case. Okay. So the Dakota gasification plant was originally built by several pipeline companies and to produce synthetic natural gas, which is sort of a misnomer, but and it was at a time when oil and gas prices were really high. But by the time the plant was constructed, the bottom had kind of fallen out of the market. And the synthetic gas they were producing was much more expensive than market price. So the companies all wanted to bail out on it. And they basically turned the plant back over to the Department of Energy because the Department of Energy had guaranteed their loans. And so the Department of Energy put it on the market and sold it, and Basin Electric Co-op from Bismarck bought it. And then brought a lawsuit against the pipeline companies and said, you might have bailed on your guarantees on the loans for construction of the plant, but you also had a commitment to buy the output of the plant, to buy all the gas it produces. And those contracts were not ended. So you're still committed. And of course, the pipelines thought they were free and clear of their obligations. So we met maybe 7 or 8 times over the course of several months, once in D.C. so the Department of Energy could participate, and the other times the participants all came to North Dakota. And eventually they reached a settlement in the hundreds of millions of dollars to buy the contracts down to market price, and then a commitment to buy the full output of the plant for the next 15 years. So it was a huge deal to Western North Dakota to have this plant. It was important to the coal industry because the plant was using coal to produce this gas. So it affected, the coal mining industry. It affected the employees. It affected families in Western North Dakota. And it was a very significant resolution. The very next case that I mediated involved a pro se litigant with a civil rights claim. And that case settled for $1,000. It was every bit as important to that litigant as the gasification plant case was to all of the litigants in that case.
And your job was the same, to bring parties together.
It was. Exactly the same skills and techniques involved.
The 2 words that I heard describe you the most when I was working for you and after I worked for you, people described you as smart and serious. And the newspapers have talked about you, and I know there's a biographer who wrote a book that also covered a hearing you covered that you were presiding over, and I think used the term smart and serious. Smart, I always felt like, as much as people talked about you being smart, you were even smarter than people said you were. But people said you were so serious, and I knew you as somebody who was funny and somebody who had a good sense of humor. But people really, do you think that's a common misperception of you, that you're a much more serious person?
It probably is for people who have only seen me in the courtroom, but anybody who has worked with me on a daily basis, or even anybody that has mediated a case with me, knows that I try to disarm hostility and tension through humor. And but I think it probably is a perception for those who have only seen me in the courtroom. And of course, people who are writing about a court proceeding will only have experienced, my demeanor in the courtroom, where I think it is important to treat the matter seriously and not to poke fun at the litigants. Well, of course, I have a favorite law clerk whose name will go unmentioned. But, no, I think serving as a judicial law clerk is just a really important launching pad for a legal career. And I've had some just outstanding law clerks over the years, and I've remained really very close to several of them. And it's just been really rewarding to see their careers flourish and to see, what they've become. I mean, some are in private practice. Nick, you're the first assistant U.S. attorney, which I'm very proud of. Sean Hastings is the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the district. You've heard of her? Perhaps met her a time or two. So, and Amy Strankowski, who was my last career law clerk, is now clerking for Judge Alice Seneschal, who now holds the full-time magistrate judge position in Fargo.
And I also want to ask you about the closest coworker that you've ever had, just in just a couple minutes. And I had the good fortune of working with her as well. Was Lori Johnson, your judicial assistant, and in many ways she kind of epitomized what a public servant was. But tell us a little bit about that relationship and how it started. And that was very much that relationship followed you from private practice to being a federal judge.
It did. Lori was a remarkable person. She was a paralegal in my law practice. And when I became the half-time magistrate judge, I was authorized one full-time assistant position. And so I asked her if she wanted to leave the law firm and take that position, or if she wanted to stay at the law firm and I would hire someone else. And she decided to take the judicial assistant position. And just like nobody knew what to do with a magistrate judge, I mean, nobody knew how to assist my chambers. So Lori did it all. She was my secretary. She was my courtroom clerk. She was my deputy clerk of court, and she docketed everything that we did. She did it all without complaint. It was an amazing amount of work. And unfortunately, a few years later, when she was in her mid-30s, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she died just shy of 5 years later. She treated her work as a refuge from her illness. And whenever she could possibly make it to the office, she did. And kept up as much work as she could. She became a very good friend over those years, and it was a huge loss.
But you guys were very much a partnership.
We were. We traveled together.
All over the state, because you guys were covering the whole state at that point.
Right. During those years, I was the only magistrate judge in the district who had any civil duties. So we traveled to Bismarck 2 or 3 times a month. We traveled to Minot occasionally. We traveled to Grand Forks pretty frequently. And sometimes we would make that whole rectangle in one trip. And so we had a lot of one-on-one time.
And this is back at a time where you're just kind of figuring out what this job should be, too. I mean, this is a very formidable part of your judging career.
It was. And Lori, was willing to work really hard and willing to try new things. It was a great partnership.
Yeah.
I still remember during my first year at this, so I would have still been part-time. Lori and I were both pregnant with our daughters. And we were in Bismarck for hearings, and we had to park. They didn't give us a parking place yet because I was still a part-timer. And so We had to park a few blocks away, and it was really icy, and we were both very pregnant, and we were skating our way, hanging on to one another to the courthouse. And we talked about that memory fairly frequently in the subsequent years.
Now, that's a story that a lot of these judges that I mentioned on here, these men, never had an experience with like you did in that sense.
Well, I would think not.
Yes,
Right.
and actually, even in more general, you kind of had to be a judge and a mom, and I know from when I clerked for you, your two wonderful kids were still kind of in their schooling years. And I know that those years, you would come into work and you'd get some tea and you would say, man, I'm tired. I had to, you spent 4 or 5 hours the night before helping, tutor classes.
Both of my children are very bright, but they had some learning challenges in particular areas when they were in school. And I spent a lot of homework time with them, particularly with my son. He was more compliant than my daughter. So he was willing to spend that time. But it was, those days were exhausting, but I wouldn't trade them for anything.
And I have to say too, because you were also taking your daughter to dance class and you were tutoring classes. I mean, in many ways, I think of you as a mentor, not only as in terms of my legal experience that I got, but also the person who is sort of also being a parent and making that an important part of your life. And to this day, I still, think about those things and it impressed me even then, just how much dedication that you had. And now I get some sense with my own children, just how exhausting that is to come into work the next day. So I have even a greater deal of respect. But I'm going to ask you briefly about your son, Kyle, who is again, went from you having to help him with a lot of his homework to now he's a genius engineer. But I want you to talk about the story about how he realized his mom was a judge and what that meant.
He was only 3 when I was appointed. And my daughter, of course, wasn't yet born when I was first appointed. And when my son was about 4 years old, I had him up at my office because we were going to go to a doctor's appointment. And but I had to do some hearings both before and after the appointment. So I don't remember if it was before or after, but he was sitting and we gave him some markers and some used paper, and he would draw on the backs of the paper. And then we let him make a couple of copies on the copy machine just because he could see how he could reproduce his work. And he thought that was pretty cool. And so he looked up at me and said, "Mommy, can boys be judges too?" And I thought, wow, that's a different perspective than the one I had when I was growing up, when I would have thought, a judge could only be someone like Judge Benson.
Mm-hmm. Does that ever sink into you that you have a historic significance to the federal judiciary?
There's one incident that brought that home to me. The reason I got involved nationally was that, our caseload was not as overwhelming as in some parts of the country. And also, I was lacking in colleagues here. There were no other magistrate judge colleagues. So I discovered by going to Federal Judicial Center educational workshops for judges that, I had these great colleagues all over the country. And I became good friends with many of them. And getting involved nationally was really a way to grow and to develop relationships with other judges. And so, I offered to serve on national committees. I got involved in the Judges Association, and I got involved in judicial education programs. And about 2 years before I retired, the Judges Association, the Federal Magistrate Judges Association, awarded me their Founders Award, which is their highest honor. That they don't necessarily give it out every year, but when they see someone that they think is deserving, they award it. And that year they awarded it to me and to my close friend, Aaron Goodstein, who is now retired and recalled magistrate judge in Milwaukee. And the current president at that time of the Magistrate Judges Association, in introducing the presentation of the award to me, asked how many of the magistrate judges in the audience had been taught by me at federal judicial center programs, and at least 90% of the hands went up. And that's when I realized that I had an impact that I had never really given much thought to before, and that I knew virtually every one of my colleagues nationwide. Now, I no longer do, because the new ones I'm not seeing in their new judge programs anymore. By the time I retired, I had known virtually every one of the magistrate judges.
Well, from your math teacher who thought you should go to MIT, to your editor-in-chief before you, who tried to solicited you to apply for that job, to Judge Benson, who wanted you to be a judge, it seems like that other people are able to identify sort of greatness in you, and you were sort of late to the party.
Story of my life.
So, now that you're done being a judge, you're retired, and you aren't very good at retiring because you still have a business.
I do.
So kind of a fail on the whole retirement area.
Yeah, I flunked retirement.
Okay. So you'll admit that.
I do.
Okay.
Okay, you've got it on record now.
Do you
Let it go.
Right. Do you ever miss being a judge? Do you miss everybody standing up when you come into a room?
I really don't. I did it for 30 years, and I really loved every day that I was a judge. And I think if I still were a judge, I would still enjoy doing it. But I started a mediation practice immediately after my retirement. I just thought 30 years is long enough. It's time to, get out of the way and let someone else do this job. But I wasn't ready to stop working. So I decided to do mediation because it was the part of judging that I had come over the years to enjoy the most, because it involves the most person-to-person contact. And so that would have been the part of judging I would have missed the most, more than sitting up distant from people. I really like people. And so I decided to keep doing the part that I had developed some skill at, that allowed me to still have really close connection to people.
And maybe that kind of answers my last question to some extent. Like, how do you most want to be remembered by others from your 30-year judicial career?
I guess I would like to be remembered as fair and as a kind person. Not in kindness in the sense of doing favors for people, which of course you can't do for litigants, but that I was willing to listen to them, to hear them out, and to try to do the right thing.
Thank you very much for talking with me. I think that you interviewed me twice in my lifetime, and now I've interviewed you once. So I appreciate that.
Fair is fair.
Yes. I appreciated being the one asking the questions. That was actually a lot less nerve-wracking. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Nick, for doing the interview. And thank you also for serving as my law clerk and being my friend.
And being the unnamed favorite law clerk ever.
Well, no comment.